when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an Ironclad original. Hey everybody, welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin, and today my guest is Sebastian Junger. Sebastian is an award-winning journalist, author, and filmmaker. His works include the books The Perfect Storm, Tribe, and War, and the documentary Restrepo. His latest book is In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. During our conversation, we get into his personal history, what it was like for him to be embedded with the military overseas, and his near-death experience. That's the subject of his latest book. We even talked about the science and physics of dying, and I had a lot of fun going down the rabbit hole with him on that. Sebastian is just a wealth of information on what it's like to endure very challenging circumstances, both from a job and a life perspective. So here we go with Sebastian Junger on the X. You know, I want to start, we actually have a couple things in common, and the biggest one, or I don't know the biggest one, but we grew up very close to one another. I'm from Massachusetts as well. You're from Belmont, right?
I'm from Belmont, yeah.
And did you, so I'm from Natick, which is, and I had a very good friend on my soccer team, like my travel soccer team when I was a kid, he went to Belmont Hill, which is a well-known school there. I actually kind of want to start there with where you grew up, because I think it's so relevant to some of the books you've read, maybe all of them, but certainly Death in Belmont and this most recent one as well, because, kind of talk about your childhood. So can you just quickly kind of give a snapshot of growing up and what interested you and maybe what set you on the path to becoming a war correspondent, a writer, that kind of thing?
Yeah, my mom was from the Midwest. Her family, her ancestors settled the Pennsylvania frontier, and actually there were two teenage boys who were killed in an Indian raid on their farmhouse in 1783, I think it was. My father was from Europe, and he grew up. He was born in 1923, and he grew up during the rise of fascism in Europe. First in Germany. His dad was Jewish. They left Germany in 1933, went to Spain. The fascists rose up in Spain in 1936. They left and went to Paris, and we all know what happened then. And he came to this country. And as a result, thank you, fascists, like he speaks every language in Europe because his family got chased all around the place.
Yeah.
And finally to the U.S. So, but he was a physicist, and he met my mom in Boston, and we grew up in a sort of middle class, very comfortable, safe, and boring, frankly, uninteresting suburb of Boston called Belmont. And I just remember as a young man just thinking, how do I test myself here, right? Like, how do I mean, clearly society doesn't need me, right? Where there's no enemy. We, the food comes in we get our food in the supermarket. Like where's the drama? When's the drama start? When's the testing begin, right? And, I was reading a lot of, I really loved anthropology when I was a kid. I was reading a lot of anthropology. I was very enamored of the American Indians. And I understood that any healthy, organic, small-scale society tests its young people and doesn't really allow them to proceed to the responsibilities and the liberties of adulthood until they've sort of proven their mettle, and in specific ways with the boys, right? They are tested physically.
Yep.
Women will be tested almost regardless through childbirth, which is extraordinarily dangerous. Before the advent of Western medicine, the risk of mortality in childbirth is 1% per birth. So if you have 5 or 6 kids, you're running the same risks that, most warriors probably ran on the battlefield over their lifetime, right? So
sure.
The women are already getting tested in incredibly frightening and painful ways. Not so the young men, right? If you're a young man and you decide you don't want any part of this, you can run away in battle, right? I mean, you can just say, thank you, no, right? And so it's very important to test young men to get them to prove that they're worth the resources. They're worth marrying your daughter to, whatever, that they're worth the worth the effort.
Right.
And I sensed this very, very deeply. And I just was in despair about how am I going to prove myself? And I started spending a lot of time in the woods. And we lived near some woods in Belmont, not much, but I made do. And I, built a sort of lean-to shelter up there. And I would spend the night up there, back when winter was really winter and there was actually snow in New England. And I'd build a fire and huddle around the fire and go to school the next morning smelling like wood smoke. And I learned how to hunt little animals, whatever. And eventually that in my 20s, I studied anthropology in college, and I was a really pretty good distance runner in college. And I lived on the Navajo reservation and trained with their best runners in the early 1980s and wrote a thesis about Navajo long distance running. And I 221 for the 221 marathon, 412 for the mile. I ran to like pretty decent times.
Wow. That's fast.
Well, it's nothing that will get you to the Olympics, but
I mean, it's faster than I'll ever run any of those things. I mean, that's quick. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I worked hard. I ran 100 miles a week, and I was a beast out there, right?
Wow.
And so and after college,
And sorry, where was this? Where was college?
I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
Oh yeah. Okay, yep.
And so I wrote a thesis, and that lit me on fire, right? I loved writing that thesis, and so I got out of school and I did construction for a while. But I was like, what am I going to do with my life? Maybe I'll be a journalist. It sounded like pretty much close to what the thesis was. And so I started trying to work as a, quote, freelance journalist, which, of course, didn't turn a dime. And I bartended and waited tables and eventually wound up as a high climber for tree companies.
Right. Yep.
So I do all the aerial work on a line with a chainsaw, taking down 100-foot white pines and what have you. Dangerous work if you make a mistake. And of course, I did make a mistake. I cut my back of my leg with the chainsaw and tore it up a bit. And but then that got me thinking about dangerous work. And I eventually wound up collecting research on dangerous work. And that became my first book, The Perfect Storm. That dangerous job, of course, being commercial fishing. I was living in a fishing town called Gloucester in north of Boston, and a local boat named the Andrea Gale sank in this huge storm in 1991. And I started limping around Gloucester. I was still healing from my chainsaw wound. I started collecting information on this local tragedy, and it became The Perfect Storm. And then eventually, I was very interested I was intrigued by war. I think partly because I was a young man, partly because my father's life had been very, very shaped by war. There was a civil war in Bosnia in the early 90s in Sarajevo. And I bought a plane ticket and went off, and I sort of learned how to become a freelance war reporter in Sarajevo. I mean, at the lamest possible level of the journalistic food chain, right? I mean, I was like plankton on the journalistic food chain, but I was working as a freelance journalist in a war zone. And the sense of meaning, just the sense of importance and meaning and immediacy of that work was completely, and I think there's probably an analogs with the U.S. military, but for me as a journalist in that wartime environment, totally intoxicating. And all I wanted to do was go run around the world reporting on wars. I had to come home and write. I got a contract for The Perfect Storm and I had to come home and write that and sort of settle down and write an actual book. But I kept war reporting off and on for many years until my buddy got killed in Libya. And, at that point I clocked out and have never been back.
When you wrote The Perfect Storm, did that evolve out of an article originally? Was it like a smaller piece that became a book, or was it just a book from the start?
Well, I collected enough material for a book. And then I wrote an article hoping that might help me get a book contract. And indeed it did, plus a book proposal. And then I wrote the book that I originally intended to write. So, So it didn't come out of the article, but they were definitely linked. Yeah.
But when you wrote that, did you know, because that was your first book, right?
Yeah.
And did you know that it would, or did you have a sense that it would take off the way, because it became everybody knows this story at this point. I certainly read the book whenever it was 20 years ago and have seen the movie. Did you know that it would have that kind of impact and bring you the success that it did? Or was it just was that, you couldn't believe, or were you just kind of like, I can't believe this just happened?
Well, sort of both. I mean, I'm a very harsh critic of my own work, and in rereading the book as I was working on the drafts, I was like, this is good writing.
Yeah.
I mean, I had sort of kind of like, wow, that's, this is a hard book to write as a journalist, and I was like, damn, that good job. Like I was quite pleased with it, and so in my own weird way, I was like, why wouldn't it be a bestseller? It's a good book, which is totally naive thinking, of course.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm like, come on, be realistic. Like I'm a first-time author. It's a book about a storm, for God's sake, and a boat that sank that no one knows what happened to it. Like, be realistic.
Yeah.
Like this, and certainly my publisher was being realistic. Like I had a tiny advance. I think their initial print run was 15,000 books or something. And,
Yeah.
I mean, a very small print run. So they weren't expecting anything much out of it either. And then it totally blew up.
Yeah. So what was it? What do you think it was that, enamored people about that story and the book? Because I think it's something that everybody was drawn to. And to your point, it's about Gloucester fishermen, which isn't a subject that people normally go, oh, I'm really interested in that subject. So what was it, do you think, about that drew people to it?
Well, I tried to break down what happened to that boat in a kind of forensic way. Like, we will never know what happened. The boat disappeared off the radio waves, just disappeared. No one knows where it is. Somewhere off Sable Island, it probably went down in an area that was experiencing 80 to 100 foot seas. And it was if I'm remembering correctly, a 72-foot boat, I think, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it waves much, much bigger than the boat is long, right?
Yep.
So, impossible conditions. And so what I tried to do was write about the forces that were acting on that boat and how it might have sunk and what's most likely. And so I went into physics of wave motion and ship stability and why boats roll over and what happens when you drown. And I sort of I had this idea. I didn't call the chapters this, but in my mind, I was, okay, one chapter is their last month at sea. The last week, as the storm was sort of gathering, away, 1,000 miles away. The last day, the storm was now on them, right?
Yeah.
The last radio communications were during that last day. The last hour and the last minute, which is when they drowned, right? So I had it sort of broken down. And I think it was something about that methodology and the just straightforward, very clear, unadorned prose that I used that just sort of captured people's imaginations. I can't know because I wrote it. I didn't read it, but I think it was something about that.
Yeah. So from there, what made you want to be a war? I always think of like a war correspondent versus a combatant, right? So, I mean, I come from a military background, being in the military, and I'm certainly somebody who, look, if I'm going to choose to go be in a combat zone, I like the idea of being able to defend myself and have a weapon, and you can't do that, right? Like you have to be in these positions where you're unarmed. You essentially, I actually don't know, but you essentially can't do anything along those lines, right? To put yourself in a combat, be a combatant, so to speak. So what makes you want to do, I guess what makes me want to do that versus being like, did you ever think I want to go join the military? And instead of that, I mean, obviously, because that's a test for people, as you were saying, right? Like that's something that,
it was a peacetime military, right? I mean, I came of age. I mean, I was 18 in 1980.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
Right. I mean, like for me, in a very real sense, if I wanted to experience combat, it was going to be as a reporter.
Right.
Or just some kind of weird mercenary in someone else's war, which just seems grotesque, right? So,
yeah.
But I really did have a belief in journalism as a one way of documenting gross human rights violations and maybe rectifying that and defending, as in World War II, like defending human rights around the world. And so the genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda and, on, I mean, the list goes on and on, unfortunately. Sadly, I was in Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Liberia.
Yep.
And I really did believe that without journalism in a war zone, things will be much worse. And at least the world, the U.S., arguably the most powerful country in the world, but the world in general will at least have good information to base good decisions on.
Yep.
Right. Without the press, you don't have that, and these tragedies happen without any. I mean, God forbid there'd been no journalists in Bosnia or whatever. And so I was now part of that cadre of journalists who were, quote, dodging bullets to bring the truth, to bear witness. I'm saying this all with a heavily ironic tone because there's such cliches, but dodging bullets to bear witness to the human tragedies, blah, blah, blah. It's easy to be cynical about it, but it's also quite true. There's a lot of truth in all that. And so that was, it wasn't until, really 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq, there was any possibility of accompanying the U.S. military in any kind of real way in combat. And I didn't cover Iraq because the country that I was very, very connected to was Afghanistan. Right, my first reporting trip to Afghanistan was 1996, when the Taliban were taking over, and then I was with Ahmad Shah Massoud in 2000 as he fought Al Qaeda and the Taliban in north in Badakhshan. And then 2001, when the Northern Alliance overran Kabul and liberated most of the country, of course, now with increasing U.S. involvement. And, I had zero interest in reporting on the U.S. military until the war kind of got sticky. I wasn't interested in Iraq because I thought it was the wrong war and I didn't know why we were there, and I was quite against it. But Afghanistan, I was like, wow, the U.S. could do a lot of good in this country, and the Afghans feel that as well. And I was all in. And I was sort of dismayed at actually how little military energy was focused on Afghanistan. It all got siphoned off to Iraq. And the war I feel like the war got, started to go more and more poorly, partly because it was sort of under-resourced. And by 2005, every year we were taking more casualties. And every year the Taliban were sort of controlling more territory. I was like, this is the exact wrong direction. What is going on here? It's America. It's the Taliban. Like we should be able to do this in a weekend. Like what is going on? And that was when I finally decided to embed with U.S. forces. And I completely fell in love with that. Right. I mean, I grew up during Vietnam in a very liberal family. Like I didn't have a predisposed interest in or affection for the U.S. military until I was actually with them in the field. And I was like, oh my God, these guys are amazing, right? And then after that, then I did my project, Restrepo project, 708.
At Ironclad, we've been able to develop a catalog of really compelling, successful, original series.
There were some dark moments.
I mean, it's unheard of, right?
Yeah. Okay, this guy's serious.
You just sensed that it was out there.
Take our learnings from what we've done and develop with those shows and bring them to our clients to make sure that they can get a service offering at Ironclad that they can't get anywhere else in the industry.
Our shows are consistently topping the charts on all platforms.
If a brand wants to come to us and work on a show together, we take a really ground-up approach.
Should we end the weeds?
Whether you want a full turnkey solution or if you already have content that you're creating, our whole goal is to handle strategy, pre-production, engineering, post-production, distribution, with the ultimate goal that our partners can focus on their messaging and let us do all the stuff behind the scenes.
So get into that, right? What got you there? So you spent this time with Battle Company up in there in the kind of Korengal Valley, that area, anyways, northeastern Afghanistan. Talk about that. What got you in there, and then just that experience? Because I think for certainly veterans like me, a lot of members of the military, we know you through this work, right? We probably older guys like me know you from The Perfect Storm as well, but know you from this, from the book War, from Tribe, certainly, which, I've read a few times, and I know a fair amount of people who are like, it's one of my favorite books. So just talk about like kind of what you got, how you got there, and then, what you learned out of that experience and saw while you were there.
Well, I was embedded with Battle Company in 2005 in Zabul province. And, literally within about 5 minutes of stepping off a Black Hawk, we were joining a team that was already like in the mountains doing a salvage operation on a Humvee that had been blown up. And within minutes, we were in a firefight. And, I sort of thought like, it was hard to picture American forces in combat. I grew up during Vietnam, and the mindset was that America's never going to make this mistake again, right? I mean, if there's another war that we're involved in, it'll be with Russia, and that'll be the end of everything. But we're not going to be slogging through rice paddies again anytime soon, right? Yeah. And I was just like, oh my God, are you kidding? I'm crouched behind a boulder with some some Americans. I've been in plenty of combat, but never with people who spoke English, right? It was inconceivable to me, right? And I was like, damn, this is, so then I just decided, if this unit goes back to Afghanistan in their, bi-yearly rotation, I want to follow them for a year as much as I can. I wanted to come and go for a year, follow one platoon in combat in Afghanistan. If they go to Iraq, I'm not interested. But they went to Afghanistan, and they went to this, what I thought was a sort of backwater, and what they thought was a backwater, which was like Kunar province. Like, who's even heard of it? Like, nothing's going on. All the heat's in the south. Like, it's the mountains. It looks like Colorado. Like, that's nothing going on.
It is right? Beautiful. Like, I will say, I've reflected. So I was there right around the same time, like 2005, 2000. Not in that exact. Well, sometime in that exact area, or pretty close to it, but certainly in Afghanistan, right around that same time. And it is one of these things where, not to completely go off track here, but you look objectively at the countryside, and you're like, this could be an adventure, sort of backpacking, extreme sport haven, like for people, if it weren't for the fact of the conflict that's going on there, right? It's a gorgeous countryside. Yeah.
I mean, it's the American West without us, right? It's the American West without the cities and the highways and all this shit that ruins it, right? Like, I mean, the Kunar River, driving up the Kunar River from Jalalabad, then in the Passion to Camp Blessing, is just like so gorgeous. Like, oh my God, what is this? And so, but no one thought there was going to be any combat, right? And I'm like, oh, well, we'll sit around and drink tea a lot, and I'll write some weird abstract book about like counterinsurgency, like yawn, like hearts and minds, I was really, and when I got in there, it was the same thing. As like, as soon as I hit the ground, we were in contact, right? I mean, and the guy, the guys I was with were also shocked. They had wanted to go to Iraq. That's where the action is. The last moment they got diverted to Afghanistan, and they thought they'd be sitting around drinking tea with the elders. And in fact, it got hot instantly, right? And the Taliban in that area really knew what they were doing. I mean, everywhere they did, obviously. And so it was, and it was, in a way, it was kind of a fair fight, right? And by that, I mean, tactically, the Taliban, for half an hour at a time, were on a sort of equal footing with American soldiers. Very steep terrain, really no chance to get armor in there. Humvees weren't really worth a damn. Air power took half an hour to get there, so the Taliban had half an hour of kind of a fair fight, and then they get out of there, right? And so, I mean, through a couple of things. So first of all, I never thought, and I felt very lucky to have this experience, but I never thought that I would see American troops in such intense combat. Yeah. Right? Like, I just didn't think that would happen. I'd seen that in other countries, but not with American forces. Like, can't we just end this? Like, how do we? I mean, we're so much more powerful. Like, why is the enemy even bothering to fight? Like, don't they know they've already lost? Like, no, they don't. and then, but the other thing was that the platoon I was with, second platoon, was posted up on this hilltop. They dug in a tiny outpost that was sort of the high ground above the company headquarters, called the COP, that sort of took the high ground from the enemy and sort of like was overwatch for everybody. Yep. And it in the valley, and it was a very exposed, remote position, and they dug it in by hand, picks and shovels, and brutally hard work. And there was no internet, there wasn't even a generator for a long time. There was no communication with the outside world. There was no television. There was no DFAC. There was no girls. There was no nothing, right? Like, it's absolutely zero.
DFAC is dining facility for anyone that's not familiar with the term too. Yeah, right. Yeah.
All they had was each other and combat, right? And both were awesome in a way. I mean, the guys that I was with, there 173rd Airborne, they're geared for combat, right? They didn't get into that sport for nothing. Like they wanted combat and they got plenty of it and they got very, very good at it. And it was also really interesting to be part of a small group. And what I realized as an anthropologist is that, a group of 30, 40, 50 people that are entirely reliant on each other for their survival, their safety, their emotional security, that's our human evolution. Like humans evolved in groups of that size for hundreds of thousands of years. We've lost that experience in modern society because we're a modern industrial society where survival needs have basically been solved on a daily basis for most people. So we don't need to huddle together in small groups to make a go of it. In combat, you do, or after a natural disaster, you might have to. But what I realized I was experiencing was the sort of the intoxication of being part of a group and being needed and being able to count on other people. The intoxication of that is a very, very ancient human experience that we sort of no longer in this society get to experience very often. And I was allowed to have, we were all allowed to have that experience. And it felt like this just like totally precious thing. I was like, oh my God, this feels different.
Yeah.
This isn't the soccer team in college. This isn't this is different. And it feels intensely good. And as one of the guys, I'll end with this, as one of the guys in the platoon said, he said, there's guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we would all die for each other.
Yeah.
Like how weird is that? And I know it's not, I don't, that you could never have that experience back in, society. Right. And so of course, when the guys came home, they were dealing with a certain amount of trauma from the sheer violence of combat and the losses they suffered, but they were also suffering from this other thing that wasn't discussed very much, which was they missed that closeness.
Yeah.
They missed the group. And part of the sort of like PTSD phenomenon of troops coming home from combat, or even not from combat, but just in the military environment where things are organized into the group level, whatever they're doing, that there's a real human loss there when you leave that kind of group and re-enter the sort of the great American suburb and get lost in it. There's a real psychological cost there that will put vulnerable people actually in serious danger of depression and even suicide.
Yeah. Well, so is there what's your interpretation of a potential solution for that, right? Because I mean, that issue, what you're talking about of just kind of lacking a tribe, right? In terms of even just everyday life, forget being a combatant or somebody in the military. But, I feel like this is an increasing issue for just humanity in general, right? We spend so much time isolated. We're just basically in a cubicle, or people are working more and more remotely. So you're at home by yourself in front of a computer, right? So, there's kind of the military component of it, of like, what do you do post-service to try and keep some semblance of that community, tribe, whatever it may be. But then just folks in general, like what do we do nowadays to try to foster that in our everyday lives?
Yeah, so it's important to realize that you can't just create a quote tribal group where people are affiliated with each other to such a degree that, as my buddy said, we would die for each other.
Yes.
Like you can't, unless there really is a reason to die for each other. Right. But you just can't say, and I think probably veterans who come back from combat and then get together again, there's something missing, right? Yeah. Like there's no longer enemy on the ridgeline, right? And so you remember all those intense bonds of that era. But in fact, you all have families, and there's other loyalties and other affiliations, and there's a real loss there. As another guy in the platoon said, as they were going off to their next assignments, he said this platoon will never again be together in the same form, and he said, and that's the saddest thing in the fucking world. Like that was his quote. Yeah, right. It's a death, right? It's a loss, and so what do you do about it? I mean, our society is very blessed, very lucky that we're affluent and safe enough that we actually don't need to live in survival groups, defending ourselves on a daily basis, hunting and gathering our own food and huddling on lean-tos while it snows. Like, I mean, we're sort of blessed that we don't have to do that. We figure those problems out for the most part. There are these moments like, immediately post 9/11, or say the Blitz in London, or the hurricane or tornado that hits the small town, where suddenly people are thrown back into that, like, we all need each other to get through kind of spirit. And what's really interesting, those terrible days are often sort of looked back on later with a lot of nostalgia by the survivors. Like, we were our best selves then. New York, I live in New York City. New Yorkers very much, the ones that remember 9/11 very much feel that way, right?
Yeah, for sure.
After Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast, same thing. The Blitz in London. I looked in my book Tribe. I looked at an earthquake that hit Italy, Avezzano, Italy, in 1915 or something like that, and I think killed like 95% of the population in a minute. 95%, right? It was like they'd been hit by a nuclear bomb, and the survivors, were had to count on each other for days until help got there. And in that environment, this guy who wrote about it said, it didn't matter if you were a criminal or wealthy or good looking or not good looking, or the mayor or the son of the mayor or a beggar. I know, whatever. It didn't matter. Like, if you were willing to participate in the group good, you were good, right? And if you weren't, you were a piece of shit. And that was it. And it doesn't matter. Like, and nothing else mattered.
Yeah.
And he said, and it was a beautiful sentiment, he said, the earthquake delivered what the law promises. The earthquake created what the law promises, but cannot in fact deliver, which is the equality of all men, all people, right?
Yeah.
So there's this.
That's great. I love that. That's
amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really
It's
cool.
this equalizing effect that I think you also see in combat, right? So there's guys in the platoon. Some were good looking, some weren't so good looking, some were from, some had their experiences with on the wrong side of the law. Some were straight A students. Some had rich daddies. Some didn't have. Some had daddies in jail. Whatever. The whole bit. None of it mattered, right? What mattered was, white, black, Latino. Nothing. All those civilian identities were of no importance. What mattered was if you were willing to put the interests of your brothers ahead of yourself.
Yep.
Would you crawl through gunfire to drag someone out? Yeah. And if not, you know what? You can take a hike. You're not one of us, right? And you see that. I looked at street gang in my book Freedom. I looked at street gangs in Chicago in the 1960s, extremely violent time. And there was a gang called the Vice Lords that had been organized just as a sort of home defense unit to protect the young men of one neighborhood against the predatory gangs from other neighborhoods, right? And the Vice Lords, it was very, very simple. Like, leadership, there was no authority. Leaders didn't have authority. All they could do was lead by example, right? But they didn't have extra rights, right? And the only definition of being in the Vice Lords was that you were willing to give your life for your brothers. That's it. And if you ran away from a street fight, they didn't beat you. They didn't do shit to you. They didn't do anything to you. They put you in a car and they drove you into the territory of the rival gang and just pushed you out of the car. You're like, all right, you want to be on your own? You're on your own. See how that goes for you, right? So that kind of loyalty makes people feel extremely good. And just to circle back to your original question, I'm sorry for the huge digression.
No, it's good because it's bringing up another point that I want to get to. So it's perfect.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you do that in a circumstance which is not life and death, which fortunately in our wonderful society usually isn't life and death? How do you do that? The short answer is you can't. Not at that level.
Yeah.
But you could kind of get halfway there. And so, I grew up in an affluent suburb, and it was, sort of lovely in some ways, but, frankly, kind of soulless and totally unaffiliated. Like, nobody knew anybody or cared about it. I mean, the neighbors didn't do anything together. No one really knew each other. Like, there was no sort of local loyalty, right? Like, and if only in my teenage brain, I was like, if only some rebels would come driving down the street with some machine guns, then there'd be a fight.
Yeah.
We would all band together. But that's never going to happen in Belmont, Massachusetts, right?
You would hope not, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's all hope not. I know precisely. But what you can do, I live in Manhattan in a totally mixed income, mixed race neighborhood, and it's at human scale. And we know a lot of people, and there's a lot of exchanges of favors, and the sort of knocking on the neighbor's door for a pound of butter or whatever. Like at all levels, like there's this wonderful affiliation. Is it a SEAL team in combat? No, it's not, obviously, but it is this. There is a sort of humanness to it, which is lost when we get affluence and safety. And the other thing that I would say, so you have to involve yourself in human groups where people need each other to make life turn out well, right? So I don't know how else to say it, and that usually means not living in an affluent neighborhood. I mean, I hate to say it, but like affluence brings great things, but it is shown not to bring happiness.
Yeah.
I mean, depression and suicide are quite high in affluent neighborhoods, and one of the reasons is that they're very isolating.
Yep.
And isolation leads to psychological struggles. It's just known to.
It's interesting because it's something I've really found out for myself post-service is especially during COVID, right? Because when COVID happened, it was like we went from being somewhat isolated to really isolated for however long that may be for different, depending on where you lived. And the thing that I changed was I'm a CrossFitter. So I'm somebody who would go to the CrossFit gym, and I used to own a gym, right? I would go every day. And the gym shut down for whatever it was, a period of months during COVID. Oh, so I built a gym in my garage, and I know how to do the workouts. Like I'm very familiar with it. I used to coach and all of that. And so I was like, well, I don't really need to go to the gym. I know how to do this safely. And so even when the gym opened back up, I was like, well, I've got this home garage now. I'll just work out at home from now on. And I did that for probably almost 2 years. And I eventually got to this point where I realized I don't miss it's not the workout portion that is missing. It's the community aspect of it. It is being there with other people. Like that's my little tribe, right? That's my community. And so I went back to the gym for that specific reason, just to like force myself to become part of a community because it was so necessary, And it's funny, I was having a conversation with a local guy here, a veteran, a Marine. We get together for various things here. There's sort of veteran support groups, and we do some mindfulness stuff and things like that. And he was saying about self-care, and he was like, people say like your grandfather didn't need. Well, I think self-care is so interesting because we essentially tell people like, hey, you're feeling alone and depressed. What you need is more alone time, which I think is the opposite thing, right? But he was making the comment, like people say, yeah, your grandfather didn't need self-care. And he said, I thought this was very profound. He said, well, yeah, he did, but he got it through his bowling league or his poker night or whatever it may be. And I was like, man, that's brilliant, right? Like that idea of it wasn't self-care, like be alone. It was, we essentially have our own therapy because we just get together. And to your point, there's no rank, there's no, who makes more money. It's like we just get our shit out and we talk and we're bowling or we're playing poker or whatever. And I just think, yeah, that's great. And it's so much better than what a lot of people do now, which is they find an ideological tribe, right? But it's not it's not a real community. They're not like really interacting with people. They're just talking online or whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that the Afghans and the Iraqis are quite puzzled by the whole idea of PTSD.
Yeah.
And for most of human history, humans were traumatized in groups and recovered from trauma in groups.
Yes.
Right? Your village was attacked by Vikings. All right, that's going to suck, right? But then the survivors are going to, they survive the same thing together and they're going to get through it together psychologically, right? And so what happens with American soldiers, who of course are just as tough and brave and blah, blah, blah as any Afghan or Iraqi fighter, except they're traumatized in a group. And then you're like, okay, disperse, like go back to your homes.
Yes.
Like, and you have to recover individually. And they've done this with rats or lab mice. If you want to traumatize a mouse, put it in a cage with a cat, right? Yep. I mean, talk about trauma, right? So they'll do that. And then the way this experiment ran, some mice were put in cages by themselves. Some mice were put in cages with other mice.
Yep.
And within a week, the mice that were returned to a cage with other mice, their behavior was indistinguishable from the mice that had not been traumatized.
Yep.
The mouse that was put in isolation never recovered.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
basically what we're doing is putting our troops into the mouse cage by, the mouse by itself.
Yeah.
They will never recover like that.
Yeah, the one I've always heard is I think it's cocaine that they gave. It's like rats or mice or whatever, right? Where it's alone and they give them cocaine, essentially, like the ability to take it themselves, and they'll take it as long as they're by themselves and they have nothing to do. But as soon as they put them in an environment where they've got other rats and they've got things to play with, they don't touch it, right? Like they don't go for it because they're getting everything they need from the community, basically, and the ability. So talk a little bit about, I want to go back to another point you made, but since you're on the kind of PTSD thing, I heard you talk about this, I think in one of your TED Talks, where I can't remember the exact stat, but it was essentially saying fewer people in the most recent wars were actually in combat, but we have way more instances of PTSD, right? And just talking about your thoughts on that, like why that may be.
Yeah, and and this is politically contentious and delicate to say, and I was repeating other people's data, but basically, like each war, from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the proportion of the number of casualties proportionally has gone down with each war, but the proportion of ongoing troops with ongoing trauma or physical disabilities has gone up. So as the actual trauma and the incidence of wounds goes down, and wounds are representative of intensity of combat, right?
Yeah.
And as that goes down, which has war by war, for the military population, the disability diagnosis has gone up in proportion to the military population. So in other words, it's going in the wrong direction. Fewer wounded means less intense combat. There should be the rates of psychological trauma should be going down. They don't. They're going the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, my wife was the youngest of 12. Her father was in his mid-50s when she was born. He was just old enough to be. He was an older soldier in World War II, and he was a lieutenant and a captain, and he fought all the way on the grounds, infantry, lieutenant and captain, all the way from North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, Italy, all the way through Italy, D-Day, all the way through France, the lowlands, into Austria. I mean, you could imagine, right? He came home, obviously enormously traumatized. I mean, how could he not be? And he settled into a totally functional life in a small town, small city in the Midwest. He was the mayor of his town. He ran the local bank. He gave out loans to people, whatever. He was a good man, a good community member for his whole life. Would never talk about the war. If he needed to talk about the war, he could walk a few blocks and visit any one of his 6 brothers who all served as well.
Right.
They all lived within blocks of him. That's not happening anymore in America, right? I mean, that is now the exception, not the norm. So when you ask, well, like, why are PTSD rates going up? One of the reasons is that it's a dispersed population, and your bowling league actually might not contain a whole lot of vets.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Great point. Yep, of course. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, lack of shared experience. Sure.
Yeah, and so the one of the and he did, there was this idea after World War II. Well, like, okay, now I'm home. My country still needs me. There's a wonderful painting by Winslow Homer, painted in the fall of 1865. So immediately after the end of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And it is called A Veteran in New Fields. It's worth looking up.
I feel like I know this. It sounds super
amazing.
Familiar. Yeah.
It's an amazing painting. It should hang in every VA office in the country, right? It doesn't, but it should. So it shows a young man in civilian clothes with a scythe, and he's harvesting wheat. And it's, Pennsylvania or somewhere. And in the corner of the painting is his military musket and his rucksack and his Union uniform, right? His military uniform he was on the northern side. And basically the message is, well done on the war. We still need you. We got to get the wheat in. It's October or whenever you harvest wheat. Like, what are you waiting for? Get to work. Like, what are you doing? Like, you can't sit around. We got to get the wheat in. And I feel like in some ways it's a pity that our country is, for the psychological health of our veterans and for everybody, frankly, that our country is affluent enough that we actually didn't need our vets when they came home, that we didn't have to say to them, okay, take a long weekend, get your thoughts together, and, it's off to the fields, off to the factories, off to the whatever. We still need you, right? This great country needs you. Don't stop now. Like, you're on a roll. And it sounds callous, right? Like, surely you deserve a break, right? And you do deserve a break. But the truth is that the psychological well-being comes from feeling needed and being with others.
Yes, right. Sense of purpose, for sure. Yep, 100%. Yeah. And so much of that is what you're saying too, again, goes back to that community idea of just like, having a community that allows you to process these things. And I think the shared experience thing is so interesting too, because when I think about that, is as it goes in sort of a negative direction, it makes itself worse, right? The more isolated we are, the less shared experiences we have. Therefore, we don't have anything to talk about. And so when we get together, you know what I mean? It just like kind of snowballs in the wrong direction.
There were some dark moments. Holy shit.
We ought to probably have dinner sometime.
They were ghosts.
Okay, this guy's serious.
I mean, it's unheard of, right?
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of children digging cobalt out of the ground.
You just sensed that it was out there.
It's like they'd been hit by a nuclear bomb.
We're not framing history correctly.
I want adaptability and versatility.
Don't draft Wolf on your fantasy team. He's not going to get the ball this year.
This is going to matter one day.
This is how I pulled myself out.
That's when my eyes were opened.
This is a whole new wildlife enemy, man. This is crazy. Who are these guys?
Us in our own country don't even have the same gratitude towards it.
And he does the right thing because he closes the distance.
We're all programmed in this world to push ourselves even farther.
I don't have to make something important, but what I have to try to do is make something you'll never forget.
I know we're coming up on time, and I want to get to your new book, because like I thought this was, first of all, I had no idea you went through this. This is like this, you nearly died, right? I want you to talk about that. But one, and the name of the book, In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife, which I think is interesting. You say the idea of it, you don't say whether you believe in it or not necessarily. So I want to get to that if we can. But yeah. I love this because it was sort of, one, there's the story, which is this harrowing story of what you went through. But then you get into the kind of the physics aspect of it and the quantum mechanics aspect of it, of like, could this really work, right? And what do we really know about reality and consciousness? And I kind of geek out on that stuff. I really dig that too. I think I would have had a great conversation with your dad if I ever could have had that. I love that stuff. So yeah, kind of go through what happened to you and then what it kind of elucidated for you in terms of this concept.
Yeah, so years after stopping war reporting, I remarried. We had two wonderful little girls who are now 7 and 4, the center of my life in every possible way. And I was sort of done with taking risks. And, one June afternoon, this was during COVID, and we were living in a very remote area. It was a 1-hour transport time to the nearest hospital. And not that I cared, because I'm a healthy guy and my family was healthy, and I just never thought I'd need to rush to the hospital anytime, in sort of in mid-sentence one afternoon, I felt this pain go through my abdomen. And what I didn't know was that I had an undiagnosed aneurysm, a ballooning of an artery, which is it's not a health issue. It's not a fitness issue. It's a completely freak structural abnormality. that is asymptomatic and extremely rare and extremely hard to diagnose. And it chose that moment to rupture. So what's going on is that I'm bleeding out into my own abdomen. I'd have been much luckier if someone had stabbed me.
Yeah.
Because then at least I know what's happening and why and where to put my finger. Right.
Right. Or I mean, all that combat scenarios that you've been in and never been, wounded in any of that. And here you got this scenario.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm immediately, my blood pressure tanks, I'm losing consciousness, and I'm a human hourglass. I'm losing a pint of blood every 10 or 15 minutes into my own abdomen.
Yep.
And I was in the woods with my wife, and near the house, and she sort of half dragged me. I was like, I don't know what's happening. I need help. Like, she half dragged me. I was sort of half stumbling to the driveway. It's this dirt driveway, and there's no cell phone signal. There's no landline. The landline, because it had been raining, the landlines were shorting out. There's no way to call for help. And we finally got one bar of signal, and at one spot in the driveway, and called the ambulance, and they came. And they didn't think, they sort of misdiagnosed me because I went into compensatory shock and actually rebooted a bit. But they brought me to the ER anyway. This is why married men live longer. It's a famous statistic. Basically because their wives are like, listen,
you're right.
He was unconscious 10 minutes ago. You're taking him downtown, right? You're not leaving him here.
Yeah.
Because I would have been like, okay, guys, I'll call you. Yeah, I'm fine. I'll make it, right? Well, I was bleeding out, and I got to the, an hour later, we finally got to the hospital, and my body was like just transitioning into end stage hemorrhagic shock. I was going into convulsions. I was maybe 10 minutes from dead. I'd lost probably 2/3 of my blood. My blood pressure was 60/40. And the doctors didn't have much to work with. And they started to, I had no idea I was dying. I mean, none. Thank God. Because
it didn't even cross your mind at all at that moment?
No, I mean, I feel like I knew I wasn't going to have a heart attack. I'm an athlete. I'm healthy, right? I'm not going to have a heart attack. It's not a stroke, belly pain. And the thing is, once your blood oxygen is that low, once your blood pressure is that low, you're not thinking very clearly, right? So,
okay,
you're like you're like the drunk at the bar, right?
Sure.
Like, that makes no sense. Like, yeah, because he's shit-faced, right? Like that.
Right.
It was that kind of thinking. Like, I just had no idea.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the doctor put a large gauge needle right through my neck into my jugular, and he was sort of working on that, and which didn't hurt at all, weirdly. And right then, this big black pit opened up underneath me, infinitely black, infinitely huge, like infinity, right? And I started to get pulled into it. And so I have to just stop for a moment and say, I'm an atheist. I'm a stone cold atheist, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a mystic. I'm not spiritual. In fact, usually I'm kind of anti all that stuff because it just all sounds kind of flaky. And my father was a physicist and also an atheist, et cetera, et cetera. Just to get our like bona fides out there, right? So I'm getting pulled into this black pit. And I start to panic because I didn't know I was dying. But, we all instinctively know, don't go into the infinitely deep, dark, black pit, right?
Yes.
So don't do that. That's not good. That won't turn out well for you, right? And I'm getting pulled in and I'm panicking. And right then my dead father, 8 years dead, appeared above me to sort of welcome me. He was like, it's okay. You don't have to fight it. You can come with me. I'll take care of you. And I was absolutely horrified. And I said to him, I sort of thought like I didn't quite see him and we weren't speaking, but he was there and we were communicating. It's the best as I can sort of describe it. And I was like, I'm not going with you. You're dead. I'm not going anywhere with you. Like I'm staying here. Like we got nothing to talk about, Dad. Like, get out of here. Like, what are you doing here? And I said to the doctor, you got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going. Right. I was enormously confused by his presence. And eventually they saved me. They were able to get a catheter in through my venous system to the ruptured artery, which is one of my 5 pancreatic arteries. and they embolized it with a coil, pulled their gear out. I needed 10 units of blood, but I made it. And in the ICU the next morning, the nurse said, when I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive." I mean, the odds of me living were technically 30%, but that's if you get to the hospital in a decent amount of time. It's not 30% if it takes you an hour and a half, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, the odds were extremely small, and I made it. And she said that, and then I was like, oh my God, I remembered my father. I remembered the black pit, and I remembered my father. It all came back to me. And so my book, In My Time of Dying, is an attempt to understand what happened. NDEs, near-death experiences, are quite common. What happened to me, what I remember, is a quite common experience. And I try to understand it in sort of rational terms. And, I wind up, I don't wind up with religion, right? I mean, people say, "So are you still an atheist?" I'm like, yes, I'm still an atheist. But I do have questions about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the universe. Questions I did not have before. That's how I wind up in quantum physics.
So yeah, so I guess talk about that aspect of it, like where that went from sort of the quantum, the physics aspect of that, right? Like the approach there, because and I'm trying to remember, is the family connection that you have, is it with Schrodinger? Is that the family connection you have?
Yeah. So my great aunt on my father's side, so my father grew up in Europe. His family was from the mother's side of his family was from Austria.
Yeah.
From Salzburg. And a lot of the great physicists of that era, meaning around 1900, when my grandmother was born, a lot of the great physicists were from Austria, Vienna, Salzburg. So my great aunt, my father's aunt, was a Schrodinger's lover.
Yes.
Schrodinger was in his 40s, a family man, about to get the Nobel Prize in physics. And his lover was this, 22-year-old, whatever she was in her 20s, 2-year-old woman, my aunt E.T., who I remember, when I was a child. And so there is this weird connection. And Schrodinger, of course, was one of the pioneers of quantum physics. And he's, famous among the lay people for his, Schrodinger's
cat, right? Yeah. I remember my dad reading that book when I was a kid, In Search of Schrodinger's Cat. I mean, I remember that, that book. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's this classic thought experiment. Like if you put a cat in a box and you have a device that produces exactly a 50-50 chance of killing the cat, and you have no way of knowing which happened, the cat is both alive and dead until you open the box.
Right.
But in quantum terms, it's both until the cat is observed.
Yes.
And once the cat's observed, it has to, in a quantum sense, it has to pick alive or dead. And in other words, unobserved, everything's a potentiality.
Yeah.
And they know that because at the subatomic level, at the quantum level, a subatomic particle like a photon, if you have two slits in a barrier with a strike plate on the other side, and you send a photon at the two slits, if you don't observe it, the photon will simultaneously go through both slits.
Right.
Impossible in the macroscopic world. You can't walk through two doorways at the same time, right?
Yep.
A photon can do that as long as you're not looking at it. If you're observing it, it has to pick one. It becomes Schrodinger's cat when you open the box. And so there's some very out there theories about consciousness producing the physical reality that it observes.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And it gets extremely abstract and mysterious and confusing. But this is real science. This isn't mysticism. This is real science, right? And the physicists, not only did they not know how to understand the results of these experiments, they were quite sort of creeped out by them, right? They just make no sense. In some ways, they make no sense at all, and yet that's what reality is. And so there are some conversations around maybe that the transition from life to death involves, at the quantum level, maybe there is some quantum information about the dead person is retained at some level, and you become both alive and dead at the same time, like Schrodinger's cat. I mean, there's no way to prove it. There's no way to disprove it. These are thought experiments. But that the book sort of winds up in that place.
Yeah. By the way, how do you observe, like, how do you measure something without observing it? Right? Like, how do we know what's happening if we're not looking at it?
Well,
is it conscious observation, or is it like, you know, you have a machine recording, you look at it later, and therefore we know that?
Well, so here, so if you have a strike plate, basically like unexposed film.
Yep.
A photon will leave a mark on unexposed film. So if you send a photon, if the strike plate on the other side of the two slits, when the photon, if you have a closed system that's not under observation, the photon will go through both slits and leave a mark on the strike plate in the film. That's multiple marks, right? Because it goes through the different slits simultaneously.
Yeah.
If you observe it by monitoring the photon with a photon detector, whatever that looks like.
Okay.
It changes it, and the photon has to pick one.
So, okay, so some kind of attention directed at it, some kind of measuring, whatever it may be. Okay.
Yeah. So, of course, inevitably, the physicists were like, okay, well, if that's true at the subatomic level, maybe the entire universe was one huge spectrum of all possibilities until conscious observation developed in this universe and forced it to become one thing, the universe that we now know.
Yeah. And the one that you talk about in the book too, which was like amazing to me, was if they do this with entangled particles, where they're on like whatever it is, opposite sides of the world, and one's being observed and one isn't, it actually, the one will retroactively adjust itself basically once it realizes, however that works, right? Like, hey, you're tricking me here, which is crazy.
Yeah. So entangled particles do this thing that seems impossible. They communicate information to each other instantaneously. In other words, faster than the speed of light, and they can do that across the universe.
Yeah.
It makes no sense, right? And yet that's how it works. So if you send one entangled particle through a pair of slits and don't watch it, and then a moment later send its entangled twin through a pair of slits and do watch it, what happens, it's called delayed choice quantum erasure. And the technical description of this experiment it's in my book. It's completely insane.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it doesn't even sound like English. But what happens is in the observed particle is forced to pick one slit, but now the universe has a problem because entangled particles have to do the same thing. And it somehow reaches back in time and changes the outcome and makes the first particle adhere to its entangled qualities and go through one slit, even though it was not observed.
Yeah. Crazy. Crazy.
Complete madness.
Yeah. And again, I can geek out on that stuff. I find it fascinating. So where did you land with this, right? Because I'm kind of in your camp. I'm not religious. I would call myself an atheist or atheist agnostic. I mean, I view those as sort of two different questions. One's what you believe, one's what you know. But I kind of put myself in that camp, right? So like, where did you land with this? Because I haven't had an experience like this, but the older I get and the more conversations I have with people, I mean, I think of things even like I think it's the second law of thermodynamics, right? Like energy can't be created or destroyed. It can just change form, right? So like when we die, the energy of that is us, where does it go? And where did it even come from in the first place, right? Like it wasn't created, it came from somewhere as well. So like, where'd you land with all this?
Well, the energy in the universe was created during the Big Bang, which is a bit of a dodge, but
yes, it is.
Because we don't know how that happened. But the Big Bang in an amount of time too small to measure created a universe that was hundreds of millions of light years across in an amount of time that's too small to measure. Think about that.
Yep.
Okay. That's where the energy came from. And the energy, what you call the energy that's in your body, the metabolic energy, that doesn't disappear. You're either cremated and that energy is combusted, and turned into heat and ashes, or you decompose and that energy goes into the soil and you're growing carrots or whatever. Like you're right.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you as a person continue in that energetic form.
Sure.
Which is what was so weird about seeing my father. Right?
Yeah.
Like, he should have been some carrots or something, but he wasn't. He was my dad. I don't get it, right? So the thing about the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, is that from the initial Big Bang, the whole universe is winding down and it's headed towards something called heat death, where there is no energy, right? The battery was fully charged 14 billion years ago, and now it's gradually winding down. And, you know, a hot bathtub full of water will cool. Eventually it cools to the ambient temperature. Well, the universe is going to cool to essentially absolute zero, where there's no energy, there is no electromagnetic activity, there is no light, there's no time, there's no nothing, right? That's where the universe is headed. And one of the problems with saying, well, you know, I believe in an afterlife and souls and such, is that you're actually you're positing something. You're positing that the soul will survive, even though the universe will not.
Yes. Right.
The entire universe is headed to zero, right? So the idea that our soul, whatever that is somehow will endure forever when the universe that these souls occur in is headed towards heat death at absolute zero. I mean, maybe, but I don't know how that would work. And it's certainly outside of the laws of the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're still a skeptic in terms of afterlife being a thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, you could have a post-death existence at the quantum level without an afterlife. Like when people say sorry for all the air quotes, but
it's okay.
These words bag air quotes because otherwise I feel like, I would just want to make sure everyone knows I'm using these words a little bit ironically, right? Like afterlife, like when you die, that's the end of your life. They can't, I mean, just semantically, it can't be an afterlife, right? Then you didn't die. Like, sorry, like just semantically, it doesn't make any sense. But also, what you're suggesting is that your individuality is retained.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
You get to continue on in a kind of floaty way where you don't have to work and, you know, you don't have to shower and you don't have to do any of those biological things, but you get to still be you, right? And I don't know, like the universe doesn't even get to do that. I don't think you're going to get to do that, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some quantum reality and some universal consciousness that's encoded at the quantum level that we engage with when we die. Like, I don't know, right? And so what people call mysticism, I call, science we don't understand yet. And that I'm wide open to.
Yes.
Right? That's very different from a discussion of whether there's a God. I mean, you could have a creator God that created completely biological beings that when they die, they are done forever. There is no afterlife, right?
Sure.
You could also have a purely mechanistic universe, no God at all, right? And a kind of post-death existence at the quantum level, right? So people equate like God and afterlife as if they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. They don't require each other. You could have both. You could have neither. Or you could have one or the other. They're utterly unrelated to each other. They don't need each other.
Yep. I could keep talking to you about this stuff probably forever because it's super. And there's even a question I didn't get to about going back to the previous thing about loyalty and bravery being sort of like unique human characteristics that I heard you talk about. I think it was in one of the audio versions of War, which I just thought was super interesting as well, that I wanted to get to. But we're at time for you, and I want to be again respectful of that. So,
well, listen, I'd be happy to come on again sometime.
Please do.
My book tour's coming up, like in the fall or something. If you want, we can hit it again. I would love that.
Yeah, I would love that as well. And and I want to state too, like you've been a supporter of the SEAL community. You've attended the Impact Forum, the foundation that we put on, and so we really appreciate that support as well. For everyone out there, go read this book. Read all of Sebastian's work, but definitely read this book. It's incredibly interesting. And the last thing I want to leave you with, this is just a complete aside, but when I was listening to the audio version of Death in Belmont, the guy who's reading, I think his name is Kevin Conway. Is that right? I think that's the guy reading the book. But he's
okay. I can't remember.
You're talking. So there's parts in that that's talking about towns in Massachusetts, and he starts talking about this town. And he says in Billerica, and I was listening to it, and I'm like, and he says it again, and I'm thinking, and I'm like, Billerica. That's what he's talking about is Billerica. Like all our weird Massachusetts names. Like the way we pronounce things, right? And I had to look at it. I'm like, well, he's right. If I were reading that, I had no idea how to pronounce it. I would say Billerica as well. So
Billerica, yeah, why not? Funny. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's funny. Yeah.
So,
I didn't know.
Well, great. Yeah. So let's get you back on. Thanks so much for talking with me here. Again, super interesting. Thanks for all the work you do. I think it's incredibly important and incredibly interesting. And so, thanks again for coming on the X. Appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. I hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for listening to On the X, an Ironclad original, presented by the Navy SEAL Foundation.